Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Lookmark, a smart wish list for apps and iTunes content. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Vitici. Hi, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right today. We've got another special guest with us today. We've got James Rath. He's a filmmaker and YouTuber and accessibility advocate who's legally blind and whose work we first became familiar with back in 2016 when he published a video called How Apple Saved My Life on his YouTube channel. It's been a couple of years since then, and James has continued to grow his YouTube channel, make films, and speak about accessibility. And accessibility is one of those things that is an important part of Apple's products and its operating systems. Apple uses WWDC as a platform to encourage third-party developers to make it a priority too. And it's also a topic that we've covered on Mac Stories, but we hadn't really talked about it yet on App Stories. So instead of Federico and I talking about things for which we have very little firsthand knowledge, we thought we would have James on the show to talk to us a little bit about some of the apps he uses and how both the Mac and iOS help him with the work that he does. Welcome to the show, James.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey, James, this is Federico. I wanted to ask you, I wanted to start with the video that John mentioned, the How Apple Saved My Life video.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember when it came out, and very quickly I saw a mention of the video on Twitter, and then suddenly it was just about everywhere. And we also linked it on the site, and it blew up online very quickly. So I wanted to ask you, a couple of years have passed, what was that experience like? How did the video play out in the days following the release on YouTube?
So the video actually almost wasn't published. Going back a little bit, as I was editing the video, I was just wondering, who would even care about this? Is this even going to mean anything to anyone else other than me? Because this is sort of just my personal dialogue, my personal testimony. So I almost just didn't publish it and just moved on to whatever next video I was going to work on. But after just sharing it with a couple of close friends, they just sort of encouraged me to just put it up anyway, see what the response would be. And it was obviously a lot better than I expected. The video is obviously a little one-sided in terms of an opinion, but it's also my personal experience. So it's sort of kind of my true story. And so people, for the most part, were very open to hearing it, even if people weren't an Apple user or maybe only had an iPod and didn't have the best maybe impression of Apple. This movie really sort of shifted some heads, and it's really cool that people can actually see how other people can use technology, not just how a mainstream able-bodied person uses it. And so the response had just been very positive, and it was spreading. Got picked up eventually by CNN and Huffington Post and other outlets. But even just when it was within the niche Mac community and the Apple blog community, it was very much very positive. And I don't know, it was a new feeling to me because I never had anything sort of take off like that up to this point.
Mm-hmm.
It was just very heartwarming knowing that other people could respond to my story, whether they could relate or they could just sort of feel a little bit more, I guess, proud of the purchase that they made, or they ever lost sight in the future, knowing that the product that they already have is already ready for them.
And I mean, of course, the video also reached Apple, and I remember it was being shared on Twitter by Tim Cook or Philip Schiller, I don't remember. But I wanted to ask you, did you hear back from accessibility engineers or designers at Apple about the video?
Oh yeah, absolutely. To this day, I have a pretty close relationship with Apple after that video, and we've kept in contact, and they've invited me to come speak at Cupertino, and I have vlogs where I got to tour the campus of Apple, so you kind of get a little bit behind the scenes look at what's going on in there. I went to WWDC last year as a guest to sort of cover some accessibility, and it was a good time, and I definitely keep in close contact with some of the engineers, some of the folks there.
Yeah, I noticed that one of your recent videos, well, I guess it's been maybe a year, almost a year now, is that you interviewed Tim Cook. Can you tell me a little bit about how that all came about and what was going on kind of around that and what were the circumstances?
Yeah, it's not a common thing that happens. And so basically what happened was Global Accessibility Awareness Week was coming up. Well, technically it's a day, but Apple likes to celebrate it for a whole week at corporate, which is really cool. More celebrations, more awareness. And so they had invited me to come in May to speak to people internally about accessibility, just have like topics and dialogues about like even things maybe a little bit outside Cupertino's realm, like Hollywood, disability representation in media, my personal experiences, and then just sort of motivational topics to really just people in the audience who might not necessarily be disabled or have maybe a connection to accessibility, get them more motivated about it and want to be more curious and be a part of that innovation that comes with it. So the following day, I was told that Tim would like to meet and do an interview. So we had very little like preparation for that, which is really cool though. So just the next morning, I go to we shot it at Cafe Max, which is around the courtyard area, and we had coffee, sat down with Tim, and just talked about accessibility, kind of in an interview format.
Yeah, when I watched your video, I was really kind of amazed that you basically had one evening to get ready for that, right?
Yeah,
Wow, that's kind of crazy. So you can imagine that must have been a little stressful.
That's just crazy. Yeah.
yeah, and not only that, but we edited the video. I edited the video and then even had it ready to go up the next morning. So it was basically a 48-hour process.
Wow.
They wanted that video to kind of just be like, it was for global accessibility awareness, so why not get it out the day ahead or on that very day? So pretty quick turnaround time.
So I would expect that a lot of people would wonder how someone who's legally blind is able to make videos. I mean, it's a visual medium, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that process. I guess for starters, what kind of gear do you use to shoot your videos, and what kind of accessibility features are there available to you in doing that help you create a video?
First off, just for those who, because it comes up more than you think, but legally blind is definitely it's a term used to describe someone who still has a little bit of sight, but it's non-correctable. Here in the United States, there's like a scale of acuity, and their best eye corrected has to be at 2200. Kind of put it in terms real quick. Someone who has perfect sight, who can see 20/20, something that you could see 200 feet away would have to be 20 feet away for a legally blind person to start to identify, if that makes sense. And for me, my vision's around the 2300 mark. So a little bit in the legally blind spectrum already. And then my eyes also get tired, and I have to adapt oftentimes to being like totally blind because of a very more complex visual disorder, but I have videos sort of describing it and also showing what it's like for me to see.
Mm-hmm.
So again, blindness is like a spectrum that 85% of people who are considered blind still have some sort of sight, whether it be shadows, light, color. And so for me, I use things like Zoom on Mac with Final Cut. I use VoiceOver when I really like, after I've gotten my timeline and everything down for a very more visual piece, I can just use VoiceOver to sort of navigate around Final Cut and apply what effects I need to which clip. I can also use, like, I haven't used iMovie in a long time, but I know that's VoiceOver accessible. I think Motion is, but I don't really touch Motion. But that's the thing, I stay on Final Cut because the problem I have with Adobe products is they're not really accessible. And you can use Zoom, but it's not the most like clean experience all the time because of how cluttered I find Premiere. And VoiceOver just doesn't really work with Premiere. So apparently Adobe hasn't gotten the message that there are blind filmmakers out there. I also, in terms of cameras, I can see better through a viewfinder. So like ordinary glasses won't work for me, but a camera, which is just a glorified magnifying glass, basically, with all the zooming capabilities, helps me see better. So I use things called focus peaking.
Okay.
So some higher end cameras usually have this. So I have a Canon XC10 that I use right now. I was on Blackmagic for a long time, which were like more cinema cameras for the low budget indie filmmaker. We're talking like range of $1,000 to $5,000. And I've kind of gone away a little bit from that and gone back to Canon, but focus peaking is basically a feature that will highlight in a bright color anything that's in focus. So as I'm turning the focus panel on the lens, it will show me what's coming into focus and what's not on the LCD screen.
Okay.
So It's very helpful. Things like a magnifier on cameras that you can find in your basic DSLR, stuff like that really does help. Having like a clean, easy to use user interface. So yeah, that's basically my accessibility features on a camera. It's not most accessible in terms of like in the UI, but I mean, if there was another accessible camera, it's iPhone, which I will use sometimes on need to pull out a camera real quick from my pocket and record something, because I can just put in an AirPod or have headphones and all of a sudden the voiceover will work with the camera app just fine.
Thanks to Lookmark for sponsoring App Stories this week. Lookmark is a smart wishlist app for almost any kind of content that you can find on iTunes and download. Lookmark works with iOS and Mac apps, movies, books, podcasts, and more. All of it can be bookmarked from your iPhone or your Mac. When you come across a movie or app that sounds interesting, but you'd like to save it for later, use Lookmark's Share extension to bookmark the content for later. The Share extension can be used wherever there are iTunes links, so the App Store, the iTunes app, or really any app that has iTunes contact in it, including when you come across an iTunes link in Safari. Lookmark doesn't require you to create a user account, but if you do, your content is synced across all your devices, and it's backed up on Lookmark servers, so you can always recover it. Lookmark also has a desktop browser extension for Safari and Chrome, so when you come across an app or some other content while you're browsing in Safari or Chrome on your Mac, you can save that for later too. Just Lookmark it. 2 clicks and it lands in Lookmark on your phone without having to pick it up. With a Lookmark Plus subscription, you can track and be notified of price changes for iOS and Mac apps. The Plus subscription also lets you track app updates. Now you can turn on automatic updates in the App Store on your iPhone, and Lookmark will show you the latest updates. The notifications even contain release notes, so you can quickly decide if you want to have a closer look at a new version. Maybe you're like me and you had hundreds of apps on your phone, really just to keep track of what was changing with them. With Lookmark, I don't have to do that anymore. I can save apps to Lookmark and let Lookmark tell me what's new. Apps that are available for pre-order work with Lookmark too. With a Plus subscription, you'll be notified when the app is released or if the release date changes. This is really useful if you're interested in a launch but not ready to purchase or pre-order. All of the basic features of Lookmark are free. A Lookmark Plus annual subscription is $13.99 with a 1-month free trial. Lookmark has a special deal for App Stories listeners, though. You can get an extra month's free trial of Lookmark Plus if you go to lookmark.io/appstories or use the link in our show notes. That link will get you an extra month of Lookmark Plus and let them know that you heard about the app on App Stories. Thanks again to Lookmark for supporting the show.
So speaking of the iPhone, of course, when it comes to shooting and editing, my impression is that you do most of that on either with a camera or on a Mac, of course.
Correct. Yeah.
What about iOS? Besides using the iPhone occasionally as a camera or using AirPods as your headphones, is there anything else on iOS that you would specifically call out as an important feature for your workflow?
Yeah, the magnifier feature absolutely will definitely be of use. So I'll use magnifier when I need to like zoom in a little bit further, maybe onto the LCD screen of the camera, even just to sort of just, you know, make sure things are consistent with my shot. I just need to actually zoom into things in the real world a bit. And then I will also oftentimes use an iPhone, but I just sort of blend it in to the into the footage. Like iPhone footage is when it's compressed with like Canon cameras, the saturation, the color technology can blend pretty well together. So I haven't really had an issue. Like people wouldn't really watch my videos and like call out the shots like, okay, this is what shot on a Canon, that's an iPhone. Like I can blend it in there pretty well. And people don't really notice that something would be on iPhone. So it's the camera technology that's in these like pocket devices is pretty amazing today.
And what about the iOS accessibility features in general? What do you feel about Apple's efforts in accessibility? And because of course I try to keep track of all the improvements that they make every year, but it's I wouldn't say it's impossible for people who don't really need these features to appreciate them. But of course, someone who uses them really in depth and on a daily basis, I think I want to hear from you. What do you think overall of Apple's efforts in accessibility on the iPhone and the iPad?
Yeah, so I use Zoom a lot, and then VoiceOver I will use when my eyes need a break, which is on a daily basis. My eyes, for certain hours of the day, just cannot really make things out and need to rest, so I can adapt and go full audio. And so with Zoom, I also love using 3D Touch, because 3D Touch enables me to sort of do a peek zoom, like just a zoom in if I want to scan a notification or scan some sort of web page or something. And this is with the Zoom controller. I should clarify that. Something that I've tried finding on Android. There's nothing quite like it though. I've had an Android phone as well in the past year to sort of like just learn accessibility on both. And that's the one thing that just keeps me on iOS is the Zoom controller, which is basically this little joystick on the screen. And when you double tap on it, it will zoom in to like the degree that you want zoomed. And you can like just sort of steer the full screen zoom around as if it's like a video game. It's easy to use and very functional. But then adding 3D touch to that layer, it just lets me like do a quick zoom in. Kind of like when you're looking at a icon on your home screen and you peek at it to kind of see the quick options. It's sort of just like a quick workflow like that to get around my screen. Other than that, I use VoiceOver that speaks screen, which is kind of like I would say a light version of VoiceOver, which just kind of reads like text and text messages, stuff like that, web pages, articles. And yeah, that's typically what I find I use a lot on my phone. Sometimes invert colors if it's the right time of day.
How does the accessibility on the Mac compared with iOS?
So they're very different frameworks. Obviously, like iOS has evolved since like 2007 as its sort of like own identity, and Mac OS has sort of been this several decade old operating system. So I think from my understanding, coding accessibility features is a very different workflow, and they have different teams for that kind of stuff. So anyway, basically, I do find it's very powerful on the Mac, especially Zoom. Like when I have Zoom enabled with full screen, and I can just quickly hold the control button, 2 fingers on my touchpad to just like get to the degree of zoom that's comfortable for my eyes and just continuously scroll around with my mouse. Love it. That I don't need really any more than that. And then I usually have increased contrast enabled just to sort of help darken borders and frames. But VoiceOver is definitely a little bit more complicated on Mac because it is, a desktop OS compared to iOS, which is a little bit more simplified. So I do know a bit of VoiceOver on Mac, but it's not something I'm a master at by any means, as opposed to like how I am on iOS. And I think a lot of blind people will agree, unless they're using VoiceOver like every day on their Mac, maybe for work or school, you'll probably find that like you'll have iOS VoiceOver kind of be your prominent tool. But I do know with the new MacBook Pros with the touch bar, you can do a lot of the same gestures now that you would do on iOS with VoiceOver, but on macOS, which is really cool. I don't have one of those yet, so I haven't quite upgraded my MacBook Pro. It's still hanging in there just fine from 2014, but eventually we'll get there.
No, that's interesting. I wanted to ask you too about third-party developers, because we've talked a little bit about Apple. How are third-party developers doing from your experience?
Better. I say there's still work to be done with like many, but I find like a lot of the apps that I use work just fine. I'm just gonna like open up Spotlight real quick and just see, like for example, I use the Starbucks app just because I need to get my coffee in the morning, and that works fine with VoiceOver. Instagram. So social media apps, I think, well, I'll talk about that in just a second. But Uber works great. It's my transportation of choice. YouTube, I usually find works just fine. And then I have the YouTube Red subscription, so I can just like listen to videos as if they're like a podcast or an audio only without my phone wasting its battery on the screen. But what I find with social media apps like Instagram and Twitter is the UI itself might be a little bit accessible. Instagram, there's still some areas like they'll release new features and it won't be VoiceOver accessible right away. Like for example, when they introduced like the direct messages and like the Insta stories and all that, they didn't quite work very well. For some reason, it always take me into the camera part when I'm trying to just look at a conversation, and it was a little buggy. I think it's gotten better, but the problem I'm having is with visual content. Obviously, Instagram is built upon photos, right? Like, what does a blind person have on Instagram? other than captions, maybe some blurry. Like we have pinch to zoom now on Instagram, which took them a long time, but finally they got that. But for people who can't really make out anything, I do a thing called image descriptions, and this is my own effort, where in my captions, I'll describe what's happening in the image, what visual content I want someone to see. And I do see other people within the disabled community doing that as well, which is, it's great, but it'd be nice if, I know with Twitter, you can add image descriptions, but you have to turn it on. It'd be nice if they had that on by default and just sort of had a little thing like, hey, this is to help visually impaired people, instead of like people who just aren't aware of it already having to like dig through settings because they're not looking for it. So why not just present it to them? If they want to turn it off and not contribute, that's their choice. So it'd be nice if we saw a little bit more effort from these social media platforms to, enable image descriptions as sort of like alt text is also another word for it, just built into the app.
I wanted to ask you, currently I have 2 HomePods at home, and the more I use them, the more I connect them to HomeKit accessories, for example, or just asking Siri questions or playing music, playing podcasts. And the more I use this voice first interface, the more I keep thinking about the potential for the accessibility community and folks who are kind of liberated by this type of device, in that it doesn't require you to touch or to see. It's primarily driven by voice. And so I wanted to ask you sort of what are your feelings about these smart speakers, and even not necessarily Siri, but the idea of a voice first assistant in general.
Personally, I use Siri sometimes. I don't always find it to be perfect because I have AirPods in a lot, and like it works with AirPods often, but if you're in a noisy environment, it's gonna probably mess up the dictation a little bit. So I am oftentimes maybe using voiceover a little bit with dictation. It's interesting because we obviously we have the Alexa, we have the Google Mini. It's definitely becoming the smart assistant speaker market is definitely growing, and it's not going away anytime soon. It's not really a fad that, at least we don't know yet. For all we know, this could all die next year. But I'd say they're here to stay a little bit for now. And my only thing with them is, having some sort of confirmation that like, are you doing the right things? Sometimes I'll tell like a voice assistant, hey, text so-and-so, and all of a sudden next thing I know, it's texting someone from high school who I still have their number and I haven't spoken to in like 7 years. And I'm like, no, don't do that. Don't FaceTime this person who I've been speaking to in 6. So I've had that happen a couple times, and it's kind of annoying. So I think we're still maybe a little too dependent on these things, and they're not perfect yet. Also, like for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, like the smart speaker probably isn't the most practical thing, but maybe the novelty of having a voice assistant of some sort still is. But maybe having like the Echo Show, for example, I don't know if that has like Alexa showing a transcript of what Alexa's saying, or if enables you to have a wireless keyboard that you can just like type like, what's the weather? And all of a sudden shows you the weather. The way I'm thinking about it now is like, is this really an accessible thing for everyone? Because accessibility means different things for different people. For people who are blind, obviously like voice and audio is one of our key ways to communicate and work into our workflows. But then people who are deaf are obviously going to have different ways to go about it. But you can type to Siri now in iOS 11. You can do it with Google Assistant, like as if you're having a text conversation with an assistant to get you information, which is cool. I felt like it took a little too long for these features to come out for these assistants, but at least they're finally here. I definitely, there's a lot of potential. I just don't think they're quite there yet. There's still progress to be made. And I think these companies should definitely invest a little bit more into their assistants and making them as smart and reliable as possible, maybe in the coming years.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, there are limitations, without a doubt. And, we've experienced the same frustrations with trying to get Siri to do various things. I wanted to switch to the Switch and ask you a little bit about the Nintendo Switch, because I know that you enjoy it a lot. I've seen some of your videos about it. And What, from an accessibility standpoint, how is it using the Nintendo Switch?
It's definitely a console with bare bones in terms of an operating system right now, because it's the thing, Nintendo doesn't really bring an operating system from one console to the next. They're always like just jumping shark and starting fresh again. Like obviously the GameCube had this limited UI, and then the Wii didn't really. Like the Wii's operating system was an evolution when it came to the Wii U, whereas like PlayStation, you've kind of had the same interface since like the PSP and PS3 kind of.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely still getting there, and updates will help. They've incorporated some things like a dark theme, which helps with my eyes, so I don't have this like blare giant white screen just overwhelming me. I think a lot of people just appreciate that. It's just easier to read. And then they have an invert colors option now, and that will work with any game. So you just like turn it on and things are all of a sudden inverted. There's also grayscale enabled, but that's sort of where it ends. I know Microsoft and Sony have like screen readers built into the UIs that they have, which people don't really know about, which is actually kind of cool. I don't know how well they work, but I do know a totally blind gamer who plays Xbox One.
Oh, wow.
And he uses Narrator, which is found on Windows because Microsoft was just able to port that over to the Xbox console. And he plays like Mortal Kombat, he plays Injustice, he plays all these games completely blind. I know EA Sports also makes their games a bit accessible too for the visual impairment community. And then for me though, personally, Nintendo does make a lot of like easy to see games off the bat. So for example, Mario Odyssey, I found like these little features that aren't these consistent accessibility features, but are just these individual ones in games definitely help with the growing library that they have. There's like an assist mode, for example, in Mario Odyssey that I turned on to play it, and it just made the game a lot easier to play because I had this guide sort of just showing me like, hey, this is the way you want to go.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, like you can still explore. You're still not limited to what you can do in the game. And in fact, it's just like a reminder of like, because I have no depth perception, so I don't know if that's like part of the background or if I can actually go in that area. If I'm looking at a forest in the back, it will actually just keep going back. It'll show me like how far I can go.
Sure. It kind of gives you a little trail or something like that.
Yeah. It's like a trail of like these arrows that like, look, this is the path to get to the end point, but you don't have to go that way. You can explore, figure out shortcuts, and we'll adjust the path as you figure things out.
So tell me the story behind your Pikachu collection, because boy, I saw your video. You have a lot of Pikachus.
So I actually have a friend who works at the Pokemon Company, and he works in the merchandising department.
Okay.
So that's kind of helped get some of those. Of course, I purchased some as well. And yeah, in my Hi, I'm James Rath video, just sort of like a quick little introduction to who I am, what I do. I am like, here's also, and those weren't even all my Pikachus. Those are just the ones that would like fit in that video on those shelves. Yeah, so I have like, I don't know, Pokemon keeps making costume Pikachus. So there's like all sorts of ones for the season where like they have a harvest, like all these holidays in Japan, like Children's Day and then like Harvest Moon Pikachu. All these ones are like based on these cool holidays. And like I get to learn a little bit about Japanese culture by like buying these Pikachus. There's a little like thing on the back that tells you a little bit of like the history behind why this one was made. There's also like some are just sort of in-game Easter eggs. Like if you play Pokemon, you'll understand like some Pikachu's actually wearing a costume of another Pokemon, basically. Like there's a Charizard one that I have where so Pikachu's like dressed up in a Charizard onesie, and it's cute. It adds a little bit of liveliness to my office. I got one. My favorite one's like Pikachu with like these big blue glasses and like a suitcase, and it's in a suit, and it's like called Intern Pikachu, and it just like sits on the desk as if it's ready to work. But I'll be doing like some live streaming on Twitch really soon here in the next like month. So kind of I got a lot of those to sort of just prepare and like have a set behind me. So like there's something interesting to look at. It's not just a bland background. And I figured like a lot of the games I'll be covering anyway might be like Mario Odyssey or Legend of Zelda or Splatoon on the Switch. So keep the Nintendo theme going, basically.
So what do you think about the giant Detective Pikachu amiibo?
Oh, I wanted to ask about that. You stole my question.
So, yeah, there's this game called Detective Pikachu going on. This Pikachu that speaks human language with sort of this grudgy voice. And I'm curious. I don't know if I'm going to get it day one, but I know there's a live action movie that's actually being worked on by, is it Legend Entertainment? It's the same studio behind The Dark Knight. So there's some big names behind this. Like, I'm curious about that because it's based on this Detective Pikachu. There's going to be this sort of Pikachu that's voiced actually by the same guy who plays Deadpool.
Oh, Ryan Reynolds, right?
Ryan Reynolds, yeah. Which is very interesting, having someone who does Deadpool and then Pikachu at the same voice. So it's going to be an interesting one, absolutely. I'm definitely going to pay attention to it, and the Amiibo might pick that up too because it's a novelty. It's a collector's item, I think, being that big.
It is. It's bigger than the 3DS itself if you use it on your 3DS.
Really?
I think so,
Wow.
yeah.
I actually just got the Pikachu 2DS XL, the one that has its nose sort of popped up a little bit in the cheeks.
Oh, that's
Like
so good. Yeah.
The show, it's actually really cool. The texture and everything is really, really nice. Because I'm replaying through like Pokemon Black and White and just like some older games to kind of pass the time, keep myself entertained a little bit while I wait for this new generation of Pokemon to be announced at some point this year, hopefully.
Yeah. So, James, to wrap up this discussion, I wanted to ask you, is there anything you would like to see come in the future to the iPhone or to the iPad, to iOS, to the Mac? Just any specific feature or accessibility improvement that you would like Apple to work on and to bring to customers?
Yeah, being a show about apps, I mean, there's some amazing accessibility apps I'm seeing all the time. And just like, for example, like Microsoft is doing some amazing things, like with Seeing AI and like Soundscape, a new app that they released recently. And I won't go into like full detail about those. You should look them up though. They're very innovative apps. Even if you're not visually impaired, check them out. You'll be blown away with what they're doing in the mobile app space. But Apple themselves, I've sent feedback. I always send feedback to them on like what I'd like to see and like what would be great. One thing on Mac, for example, is like I want to be able to use Zoom, but with an external monitor, but have like separate Zooms. So like maybe I'm watching a show on Netflix with audio descriptions or editing in Final Cut, but I want to stay zoomed in on one screen without my Zoom affecting my other screen, you know?
James, I want to really thank you for taking the time and spending it with us today on App Stories. We really appreciate it. And I think your insights have been going to be really valuable to some of our listeners to understand a little bit better, I think, what accessibility means. And it's always interesting to me to see how it affects kind of the day-to-day real life of the people who use those features.
Appreciate it. Yeah. Thanks to your listeners for listening and just give it a shot. Listen and maybe explore some accessibility stuff within their own devices.
That's it for this week. Thanks again to James for joining us on the show, and thanks to Lookmark for sponsoring this episode. You can find me and Federico on Twitter, where Federico is at Viticci, that's VITICCI, and I'm at John Voorhees, JOHN VOORHWES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.